Thank you. Thank you so very much for being here. And I love you all, too. Last night, I congratulated Donald Trump and offered to work with him on behalf of our country. I hope that he will be a successful president for all Americans. This is not the outcome we wanted or we worked so hard for, and I'm sorry that we did not win this election for the values we share and the vision we hold for our country. But I feel pride and gratitude for this wonderful campaign that we built together, this vast, diverse, creative, unruly, energized campaign. You represent the best of America, and being your candidate has been one of the greatest honors of my life.
Yes, clap, clap. I love this moment. Don't get me wrong, I was unclear on what it meant for Donald Trump to basically win the election. By the same token, I was perfectly clear that I was going to enjoy this concession speech. Keep in mind, from my standpoint, I was like, yeah, I don't know what Trump means. I do know I didn't want her to win. It's clear on that point. I mean, let's be very clear. When Bernie Sanders was running in the race, they basically decapitated him. They kneecapped him all along the way, cheated the guy, flagrantly cheated the guy in the race, her. She started the race off under an FBI criminal investigation. And usually that will be one of those things that will, not necessarily allow a person to run, but in her case, she ran anyway. She ran against Trump. And in running against Trump, she loses. It takes her a day to concede the race. And then she comes out and gives this speech. Now, the thing I want to point to is this notion that you're the best of America, and this is the campaign that I wanted to run, because I want to dig into the campaign that she actually ran, especially around this notion of Trump and Russia at the point in which she loses the race. And I want to try to impart the gravity of what had taken place from the standpoint of the Trump and Russia psyop. And Donald Trump, in this very specific case, is coming for Clinton. And I know as I say that, it sounds extremely dirty, and I was sitting here laughing at the title of the video, but the video title is that. Donald Trump is suing Clinton, the DNC, and a motley crew of other corrupt characters that were involved in the crafting and dissemination of Trump and Russia, basically defaming his character and making it look as if an elected leader of this country was put there by basically a foreign and a hostile actor. I want to dig into this, and let's be very clear right off the bat. For the soul of this republic, I would go so far, and look, I'm a lefty. I don't particularly like Trump all that much. I don't like him at all. I don't think much of him. He is very low in my regard. By the same token, on this particular issue, Trump is entirely and completely correct. What they did was astonishingly off the reservation, going so far as to basically try to depose a sitting president in a soft coup using a conspiracy theory that was stovepiped into the FBI and disseminated by media that basically hated the president of the United States. He was a duly elected leader, and they made it look as if his administration was somehow illegitimate because of the claims that they were basically making. It is a big, big deal for them to be able to impeach a sitting president on something that was flagrantly just not true. It was made up. People are being indicted right now, as we speak, for lying to the FBI on the issue of Trump and Russia. And that is what I want to talk about today, this morning. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and of course, subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. I want to get into this because I've been sitting here thinking Trump is completely right about this. And especially now with the indictments. The catch is, I would have wanted, my preference, for him to be a little bit more specific and a little bit more targeted into hitting things that were, let's say, dead on, that he can entirely prove and nail down beyond a shadow of a doubt. But we're talking about Trump, so my request or my want for that is somewhat unreasonable. And he basically has a 108-page sprawling complaint with all sorts of people that are involved, basically weaving together many of the stories. And just to go into the lawsuit, right here, this is Politico. The new lawsuit filed Thursday in federal court in Fort Pierce, Florida, accuses Clinton, her campaign, various campaign aides, former FBI Director James Comey, the DNC, and others of racketeering conspiracy for allegedly joining in an, quote, unthinkable plot to falsely accuse Trump of colluding with Russia in the 2016 presidential election. Well, they did accuse him of that. In the run-up to the 2016 presidential election, and this is a quote, presidential election, Hillary Clinton and her cohorts orchestrated an unthinkable plot, one that shocks the conscience in an effort to affront this nation's democracy, the complaint says. Acting in concert, the defendants maliciously conspired to weave a false narrative that their Republican opponent, Donald J. Trump, was colluding with a hostile foreign sovereignty. Bastards, how dare they? The actions taken in furtherance of their scheme, falsifying evidence, deceiving law enforcement, and exploiting access to highly sensitive data sources was so outrageous, subversive, incendiary that even the event of Watergate pales in comparison. Trying to give it due justice, right? And I agree with her. Agree with everything that was said there, because all of it just so happens to be true. They were spying on him. They were using their privilege and their influence and access to people who were in these high-tech spaces to spy on Trump and to spy on his information when he was basically in the White House as a sitting president. It was outrageous. Even from the standpoint of the stovepiping, conspiracy theories, lying to the FBI, and then having your lemmings in media to basically run out with it because they hate Donald Trump that much that they were willing to believe and put out anything, regardless of how ludicrous, unsourced, unacknowledged, nobody necessarily knew where it came from, but they would run it over and over and over again. How many stories did they get wrong giving Donald Trump credit for something? Conversely, how many stories did they get wrong attacking Trump for something that he did not do? And yeah, that was a feature over and over and over again over the course of the Trump administration. My basic point is, how is he wrong? With the indictments of Sussman and Danchenko, it makes it pretty clear that there was a huge motley crew of Clinton characters. And yeah, I strongly believe sources within the FBI and everything else that was working with these guys in order to go after and get rid of Trump. They thought he didn't deserve to be in that office, and they were trying to find ways to get rid of him. From the standpoint of Clinton, yeah, how can you, it should be without a shadow of a doubt at this point that this is true. This is shattered. I'm just going to read this part, just to start it off. Hillary Clinton declined to take responsibility for her own loss. Quote, she is not being particularly self-reflective, said one longtime ally who was on calls with her shortly after the election. Instead, Hillary Clinton kept pointing the finger at Comey and Russia. Quote, she wants to make sure that all of these narratives get spun the right way. Quotes. That strategy has been set within 24 hours of her concession speech, that speech. Mook and Podesta assembled her communications team in Brooklyn headquarters to engineer the case that the election wasn't entirely on the up and up. For a couple of hours, with Shake Shack containers littering the room, they went over the script they would pitch to the press and to the public. Already, Russia hacking was the centerpiece of that argument. In Brooklyn, her team coalesced around the idea that Russia hacking was the major unreported story of the campaign, overshadowed by the contents of the emails and Hillary's own private email imbroglio. They also decided to hammer the media for focus so intently on the investigation of her emails, which created a cloud over her candidacy. Basically, within 24 hours, Trump, Russia, hacking, etc., basically came together in their narrative of basically why she lost that race. It wasn't because she was a horrible candidate. It wasn't because she was in an FBI investigation when she basically started the race. It wasn't because of the hijinks around the emails and the corruption and the uncertainty around issues of honesty and trust and those type of things. I mean, for God's sake, the woman has been in the public eye for God knows. It's not like the public doesn't know who she is. And so, no, it wasn't those reasons. It wasn't that she was the most hated candidate, literally, with the exception of Donald Trump. No, it's not that. Trump, Russia, that's why I lost. Oh, and James Comey. He has something to do with it. Also, yeah, not so much. This was basically a plan by the Clinton campaign, and this kind of went in two ways. In one sense, you have, this is why I lost the race, or at the very least, attacking Trump with the Trump and Russia stuff to damage the campaign in one sense. In the second sense, at the point at which he lost, it was used to basically absolve herself of blame, to impugn the credibility and the legitimacy of the Trump administration, secondary, and third, to rip him out of that office in a soft coup. And tell me that wasn't amply possible. If Comey came back with anything, not Comey, I'm sorry, if Mueller came back with anything in that report, real or imagined, what do you think would have been the call? The call would have been, he needs to be taken out in a coup. His candidacy is illegitimate. You might have even gotten Hillary Clinton trying to do a lawsuit to worm her way back into that office, all based on fictitious ramblings and wishful thinking of Democrats. It is utterly astonishing when you think of the scale that this has gotten. And again, it's even worse than that. Because the fact of the matter is, the exact thing that they were accusing Donald Trump of, Hillary Clinton was in fact doing. Or at the very least, the DNC on behalf of Hillary Clinton was actually doing. This is the rub, and this is the reality of it. Right here. Right here, right here. This is from that clearly Russia propaganda rag, Politico. Ukrainian efforts to sabotage Trump backfire. Whoa, what do you mean backfire? What do you mean backfire? Because you basically had DNC operatives working with the Ukrainian government to elicit information in order to damage Trump's campaign by hitting people that were close to Trump. They were even trying to get the president to basically say this thing with Manafort in order to get some kind of congressional investigations. This is the DNC on behalf of Clinton, maybe she was related to it. I mean, after all, this is for her campaign, working with a foreign power in the way that they said Trump was working with Russia in order to elicit information to damage the political candidate. The media didn't care about that. Didn't care about that. And to put a finer point on it, Ukrainian court. I mean, the president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, at the time was apparently freaked out. Keep in mind, when the day that Donald Trump won that race, 96% was basically saying that Trump was going to lose. So from the standpoint of everybody's context of the world, or most people's context anyway, he didn't stand a chance. So if you're a submissive Ukrainian government, and as a submissive Ukrainian government, wearing a gimp suit, ass out, gimp suit, all the time, because you're basically a fledgling government. You knocked over, or the U.S. helped you knock over the government in a coup, putting these kind of neo-Nazis in. You open up a bloody campaign of terror on the ethnic Russian Ukrainians, basically calling them terrorists because they didn't want to be a part of government. They basically hated their guts. And the government was on the brink. And so they thought, we need the U.S. to survive. So we are going to help the U.S. out when the U.S. needs it. But in this specific case, it's not the U.S., it's the Democratic Party, because they is the party that they think is going to win the race. Of course, we're going to help out Hillary Clinton because Hillary Clinton is going to win the race. Everybody knows it. Oh my God, she didn't win the race. And so they were making the point. Trump was pissed. And Poroshenko was looking around thinking to himself, oh my God, this is a problem. We depend on the U.S. to exist. and I've just done something to the new president. That was that article. Ukraine even goes right here. A Kiev court said that a Ukrainian lawmaker and top anti-corruption official decision in 2016 to publish documents linked to President Donald Trump's then campaign chairman amounted to interference in the U.S. elections. Yes, it did. Literally so. The December 11th finding came in response to a complaint filed by another Ukrainian lawmaker who alleged that Lurchenko and Stilik illegally released documents in August 2016 showing payments by a Ukrainian political party to Trump's then campaign chairman, Paul Manafort. And if you remember, this eventually creates a firestorm. Manafort gets locked up, and not just locked up. Every time the media talks about Manafort, they always wrap it into this kind of weird collage as if it had something to do with Trump and his campaign. This was stuff that happened years ago. And yet, it all gets wrapped into Trump, corruption, Trump and Russia, Manafort, etc., etc. The goal was to damage his campaign. And the DNC, Clinton, were trying to find whatever level by hook or by crook to do it. And so, yes, they crafted a narrative of something that they themselves were doing. And the media's hysteria over what they believe Trump did is basically equaled by the level of crickets at what Clinton was doing. It's amazing. It's as if it happens to Trump, it's fair game. If it happens to Clinton, not so much, or at the very least, pay no attention to what the other side, in this case, is doing. Yeah, it's a big deal. On top of that, Democrats did something else that can't be understated. It is typically taboo in this country to impugn the legitimacy of a U.S. election. That is not something that candidates typically do. And the reason is rather obvious. The entire legitimacy, the edifice of our, let's say, system of government is dependent upon legitimacy. And that legitimacy is conferred through the vote and political access. Meaning, there's a rule set. That rule set that you follow are that elections gets this kind of sense of the will of the people, and based upon who the public chooses, they put into that spot. They typically don't hit at that, because the moment that you hit at that, you start to unravel and put doubts into people's heads about the legitimacy of a particular candidate. And if a candidate or person is in that office and you don't believe that person is legitimate, and you get enough people not believing that person is legitimate, you will get civil strife, to put it mildly. At that point, you have a citizenry, basically, especially the ones that did not vote for that candidate. You get licensed by those people to basically say, yo, we're not under your rules, man, because you didn't necessarily get there legitimately. Now, Democrats basically did this en masse in somewhat of a surly way by basically saying the Russians helped him. He's illegitimate. For whatever reason, he's not the same as the other presidents. He's something else that's not quite of the same measure, or for that matter, having the same powers as the other presidents. Yeah, they made it look as if his particular candidate was illegitimate because he got there through illegitimate means. Even the sanctions that they were trying to get Trump to basically pass on Russia, think of what that meant. When Trump was reluctant to pass those sanctions, why do you think he was reluctant to pass those sanctions? From their framing of the world, everything was Trump is working with the Russians. So Trump doesn't want to pass the sanctions because he's trying to help the Russians. As opposed to, if Trump passes sanctions that Russia interfered with the election, Trump is basically saying, I got into this office with the help of a foreign hostile actor. Why would he want to admit to that? Especially since it wasn't true. It wasn't true. Yeah, from my standpoint, they are guilty as sin. And not just guilty as sin, right now, we are in a standoff. At the very least, we're acting as if Ukraine is the 51st state or something, or some kind of ally. Basically, a vassal state on the border of Russia was knocked over by the United States. And a patsy puppet government was injected on the border of Russia. Russia already had security issues associated with NATO continuously expanding and gobbling up nations, going all the way up into the point of the border, basically encircling the country. At the point where the Soviet Union fell, you'd have think NATO would have basically went up in smoke, but of course not. It's a power projection device, and they don't necessarily want to give up power once it's accrued, especially when it allows the US to project influence and dominance in Europe. Instead of being rational actors and acknowledging that Russia has sincere or real legitimate security concerns, it's like, hey, you see two people making an argument. One person says, I am being encircled, you're surrounding me, you're gobbling up countries and coming to my border, and you're a hostile military organization. The other one says, we are love and light, puppies and rainbows, and you're not being encircled. You look at a map, which one is telling the truth? And if that one is telling the truth about, yes, we're being encircled, do they have legitimate security concerns? Now, from the standpoint of having a puppet government on the border, this would be intolerable even for the United States, or especially for the United States. And so when Russia is basically saying, we need to negotiate, we need to negotiate, we need to negotiate, you need to fulfill the Minsk Accords, you need to fulfill the Minsk II Accords, you should be pushing Ukraine to do this, you should be pushing Ukraine to do this. And considering the level of submissiveness that Ukraine is encountering at this point, you would think that if the US wanted them to implement it, they would have implemented it. Yes, there are all sorts of neo-Nazis in that government, or at the very least within the context of the military, and let's say a sympathetic government. And that wasn't something that was politically feasible, let's say it that way, for Zelensky to do regardless of how he got into that office. But with pressure, potentially, I seriously doubt that pressure was there. And instead, gassing the head up of that country as if they were going to be part of NATO, meaning a hostile military organization that is integrating this particular country, that is on the border of that country, ran by a government that is sympathetic to basically Nazi battalions that are integrated and paid by the military. Yes, that is an intolerable situation. So, Russia comes out and says they want to negotiate. But what is the climate at this point in the United States? Now, the climate in the United States is that Trump was helped by the Russians to get in office. And for 4 years, every day, that PSYOP was basically playing over and over and over again in mass to the American public, but especially to Democrats who still believe to this day that the Russians helped Trump win that race, despite the fact that all of that stuff fell apart over the course of the last year or so. My point is that the context that Hillary Clinton set by creating and crafting that PSYOP basically set the tone and tenor of any conversation that was going to come out from Russia, basically saying, we want security concerns and guarantees. Meaning, there was no way for Biden to have that conversation or even want to have that conversation in the context of democratic politics. This is something I've been saying for years. There was never going to be a situation where all of a sudden the energy that is being put out like that just stops. Never going to be that way. That is not the way that stuff works. It is going to stay seeped into the public itself, especially in Democrats. And you have a Democrat in office, part of NATO, and yet they wouldn't openly say it. They wouldn't openly say it. And so we have this kind of, I guess my point is this. The Trump and Russia stuff set a horrible context. And it created the situation with a hostile press, a hostile political environment. And so a pragmatic, straightforward suggestion that everybody agrees with. And like I said, that Zelensky even said behind the scenes, they were already telling him, you are never going to be a part of NATO. Or at the very least, no time soon. None of them would say it. Because saying it will come across as if you're making a concession to a hostile foreign actor that interfered with our election, that helped Trump get in office, and Trump was grotesque and horrible. And so there is no way to speak pragmatically about an issue in order to avert a larger conflict. That's assuming even that the U.S. didn't necessarily want to use Ukraine to bleed Russia in this case. Either way, the point I'm making is the context that it set was horrendous, especially in the context of trying to bring down some level of hysteria over a situation on the geopolitical stage. Yeah, what Clinton did cannot be overstated. That's my point. And so, whether Trump gets her or not, I don't know. Trump comes for her. I damn sure hope he gets her. Like I said, I wish he would have narrowed the scope of this a bit. That would have been more targeted into something specific as opposed to kind of going along with this kind of shotgun approach. But all things being equal, yeah, I hope he gets her. I hope he gets her. So we'll see. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. And Kelly Lane, the fact that Hillary Clinton's former campaign manager is now a national security advisor is more evidence of rot at the core of our country. I'd do you one better. When James Comey came out, and if you remember, Hillary Clinton was under a federal, basically a criminal investigation. And the whole point was, did she maliciously, or at the very least, reveal state secrets in the way that she was, let's say, using her system and everything else? And Comey basically came out and made a ridiculously weird, rambling announcement that at one point indicted her, but simultaneously cleared her. It made zero sense. He's basically saying, yes, she's guilty. However, and then he just moves the goalposts as if there wasn't people sitting in jail for the exact crime that Hillary basically committed in loosening, meaning it didn't matter if she intentionally revealed state secrets. Didn't matter one iota. Was she frivolous in the way that she was going about her security concerns? And if she was, then that would lean towards the side of guilt, because the federal government doesn't necessarily always care whether you did something intentionally or not. Sometimes they just care, is it foreseeable that so-and-so would take place? So, look, I'm going to end this here because I don't necessarily want to go too long. But needless to say, Trump pushing the lawsuit. I wish him the greatest luck in the world. Clearly, I don't like Trump. I've never liked Trump. He fits very low in my regard. By the same token, wish him well on this. Definitely wish him well on this. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I'm going to say subscribe.